On a Tuesday afternoon in 2019, in a rented office in Boston, a serial entrepreneur named Ben Lamb sat across from a Harvard geneticist named George Church and asked him one question. If you had unlimited capital and had to spend the rest of your life on a single project, what would it be and why? Church didn't hesitate. He said he would bring back the woolly mammoth. Lamb didn't laugh. 2 years later, he had raised $15 million to try. Today, that number is over $400 million. And the animal they are trying to build has never existed in the history of life on Earth. Here is the claim, stated plainly before anything else. A company in Dallas, Texas, is trying to make an Asian elephant grow wool. Not metaphorically. An elephant, the actual living endangered species, genetically edited, gene by gene, until it can survive in the Arctic the way its extinct cousin once did. The company is called Colossal Biosciences. Its stated timeline is 2028, and whether or not that date holds, the amount of real science, real money, and real persistence already spent chasing it deserves a closer look than the headlines usually give it. I want to start with the animal that's missing from this story, because you can't understand what Colossal is attempting until you understand what disappeared. The woolly mammoth was not some exotic, unfamiliar creature. It was, for most of the last 100,000 years, one of the most successful large animals on the planet. A cold-adapted relative of the elephant that once ranged across Siberia, northern Europe, and much of North America, in numbers that may have reached into the millions. It stood up to 3.5 meters at the shoulder, weighed as much as 6 metric tons, and carried a coat of hair up to 1 meter long over a layer of fat nearly 10 centimeters thick. An insulation system built for an animal that lived its entire life in temperatures that would kill an African elephant within hours. Its curved tusks, some growing past 4 meters, were used to sweep snow off buried vegetation. Its migratory grazing kept grasslands open across an entire biome now called the Mammoth Steppe. A cold, dry grassland that stretched from Spain to Canada, and that largely disappeared along with the animal that maintained it. The mammoth didn't just live on that landscape. It kept the landscape from becoming something else. And then, roughly 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended and human hunters spread across its range, the mammoth began to vanish. Most populations were gone within a few thousand years. One small, isolated group survived far longer than anyone expected. A population on Wrangel Island, off the Siberian coast, cut off from the mainland by rising seas, that persisted in shrinking numbers until it finally disappeared around 4,000 years ago. That date is worth sitting with. 4,000 years ago, the pyramids at Giza had already been standing for centuries. Woolly mammoths were still alive on an island in the Arctic Ocean, while the wheel, writing, and the first cities already existed elsewhere on Earth. The animal we think of as prehistoric outlived prehistory itself. What was lost with it was not just a species. It was a set of ecological relationships nobody has been able to fully replace. Research on Arctic permafrost has shown that large grazing animals moving across frozen ground in winter compact snow that would otherwise insulate the soil beneath it. And compacted snow keeps that soil colder, which matters because permafrost holds an enormous amount of carbon that stays locked away only as long as the ground beneath it stays frozen. Without large herds trampling the snow flat, more heat reaches the soil, and the permafrost thaws faster. It's a specific, measurable mechanical relationship, not a general idea about nature's balance. The weight of a herd's feet distributed across frozen ground, changing how fast that ground warms underneath. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because it matters for everything that follows. Colossal is not cloning a mammoth. Nobody has ever recovered a living mammoth cell, and most scientists doubt one could survive tens of thousands of years frozen in the tundra. The DNA that has been recovered is fragmented, degraded, and full of gaps. What Colossal is actually doing is something else entirely, and understanding the difference is the whole story. Here is where the science gets specific, and where I think it gets genuinely interesting. The Asian elephant and the woolly mammoth share 99.6% of their DNA. That number gets repeated constantly, and on its own, it's misleading, because a shared genome isn't the same as a shared body. Humans and chimpanzees share roughly 98.8% of their DNA, and nobody would mistake one for the other. The half of 1% that differs between an elephant and a mammoth isn't spread evenly and harmlessly across the genome. It's concentrated in a relatively small number of genes that control very specific, very consequential traits. The genes for hair length and density, the genes for a particular kind of fat storage, the genes for a hemoglobin variant that carries oxygen efficiently in freezing blood, the genes that shape ear size, since large ears radiate heat an Arctic animal can't afford to lose. Since 2015, working from genetic material recovered from dozens of preserved mammoth specimens, Colossal's science team, under Harvard geneticist George Church and paleogeneticist Beth Shapiro, has assembled a working mammoth genome pieced together from 65 separate ancient samples spanning roughly 700,000 years, and used it to identify which specific genes are responsible for which specific traits. Using CRISPR gene editing technology, alongside newer tools that can insert genetic material with more precision, the team has now made more than 60 targeted edits into elephant cells, up from 45 in 2017, each one swapping a piece of elephant DNA for the corresponding mammoth version at a location the genome comparison flagged as functionally important. The reason this requires dozens of separate edits, rather than one, is that cold tolerance in a large mammal isn't a single switch. It's an assembly of separate systems that all have to work together. Hair growth is controlled by different genes than fat metabolism, which is controlled by different genes than blood oxygen chemistry, which is controlled by different genes than ear and body proportions. An animal built to survive an Arctic winter needs all of those systems functioning at once, which is why the mammoth genome comparison didn't point to one gene, but to dozens, each one solving a separate piece of the same underlying problem. How do you keep a 6-ton body warm and alive at 40 degrees below zero? In March of 2025, Colossal produced the first physical proof that this approach actually works. Not in an elephant, but in a mouse. Using the same gene editing method, and targeting genes already known to control hair growth in mammals, the team produced a litter of mice with long, shaggy, golden-brown coats, noticeably different from the short gray fur of an ordinary lab mouse. 2 of them were named Chip and Dale. The company's chief animal officer, Matt James, described the woolly mice as a way to check a box. Proof that the specific genes they were targeting in the mammoth genome were, in fact, responsible for the traits they were supposed to control, tested in a species that breeds and shows results in weeks rather than the nearly 2 years an elephant pregnancy requires. It was a small experiment on a small animal, but it answered a real question. Does editing these particular genes actually produce this particular trait? The mice said yes. The most important part of the mammoth's story hasn't happened yet, and that's worth being upfront about rather than glossing over. As of now, no mammoth-elephant hybrid embryo has been carried to term. Colossal's own stated target is to produce viable embryos in the near term, with the company's public goal being live calves by 2028, though CEO Ben Lamb has said publicly that given a 22-month elephant gestation period, other de-extinction projects the company is running in parallel, including work on the thylacine and the dodo, are likely to produce results before the mammoth does. The reason the elephant timeline moves slowly isn't bureaucracy, it's biology. The Asian elephant is itself an endangered species, with roughly 40 to 50,000 individuals remaining in the wild, which means Colossal cannot simply use elephants as disposable research material. Every step has to be developed and validated first in cell cultures and in other species, before it can ethically be attempted in a living elephant, whose pregnancy, once begun, cannot be rushed, repeated casually, or treated as expendable. There's one part of this story that's still genuinely unresolved, and I think it deserves to be named directly, rather than argued around. A real, serious scientific disagreement exists over whether what Colossal produces in 2028, if it produces anything, should be called a mammoth at all. Colossal's own chief scientist, paleogeneticist Beth Shapiro, has said publicly that it's impossible to bring back an organism identical to one that used to be alive, and has described a related project, the company's gene-edited dire wolves born in 2025, in her own words, as gray wolves carrying 20 edits. Outside critics go further. Some conservation biologists argue that an elephant carrying several dozen mammoth genes is, genetically, still an elephant. A modified elephant, not a resurrected mammoth, and that describing it otherwise risks distracting attention and funding away from the harder, less glamorous work of protecting species that are still alive today. Colossal's own position, stated by Lamb, is more modest than the headlines that cover it. The resulting animal, he argues, will look like a mammoth, behave like a mammoth in the ways that matter for its environment, and restore something like the ecological role mammoths once played in the Arctic, even while remaining, on a genetic level, an elephant carrying mammoth traits, not a mammoth itself. I think that distinction is worth sitting with, because it's the honest version of what's actually being attempted, and it's more interesting than the simplified version. What's easy to miss, underneath the headline about mammoths, is how much has already been built that has nothing to do with mammoths at all. Since its founding in 2021 with that first $15 million round, Colossal has grown into a company valued at over $10 billion, employing more than 260 geneticists, reproductive biologists, and ecologists. In April of 2025, the same gene editing and cloning techniques developed for the Mammoth Project were used to produce 3 dire wolf pups, Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, cloned from gray wolf cells edited with genetic material recovered from a 13,000-year-old tooth and a 72,000-year-old ear bone. The company has separate, ongoing projects working to restore the thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, extinct since 1936, and the dodo, extinct since the late 1700s. The dodo team has already completed a high-coverage genome and successful gene editing in bird reproductive cells. A 17-person team is developing artificial womb technology, originally intended to let marsupial and bird embryos develop without a living surrogate, that Lamb has said may eventually apply to human fertility treatment as well. And in February of 2026, Colossal announced a partnership with the United Arab Emirates to build the first BioVault, a facility permanently housed at Dubai's Museum of the Future, designed to freeze and store genetic material for more than 10,000 species, starting with the 100 most endangered animals on Earth, so that whatever this technology becomes capable of in the future, the raw genetic material to use it on won't have already disappeared. None of that guarantees the mammoth arrives on schedule. Timelines in this kind of research shift constantly. Lamb himself has acknowledged that a separate project, intended to revive the extinct moa bird, will not meet its original target date, and has been open about the fact that experiments stall and species advance at different speeds depending on problems nobody can fully predict in advance. But the infrastructure being built to chase the hardest possible version of this idea, sequencing ancient genomes, editing genes with a level of precision the field didn't have a decade ago, developing artificial reproduction technology, freezing the genetic material of species still alive today before they're lost the way the mammoth was, that infrastructure exists now, on a schedule of its own, mammoth or no mammoth. Step back from the gene edits and the funding rounds for a moment, and look at the actual shape of what's happened. One geneticist spent decades studying an extinct animal's DNA out of curiosity. One entrepreneur asked him a single question in a rented office. That conversation became a $15 million bet in 2021. The bet became 45 gene edits by the following year, then 60. The gene edits became a litter of golden-haired mice in 2025, proof in miniature that the approach could work at all. The mice became a $10 billion company with 260 scientists, a BioVault in Dubai, and gene-edited wolf pups already born and already growing up in Texas. None of that was mammoths. All of it was mammoths, the accumulated compounding result of one conversation nobody outside that room heard 7 years ago. There's a specific word that keeps surfacing in how the people building this describe their own work, and it's not a word you'd expect. Iterative. Not miraculous, not revolutionary. Iterative. Small, specific, testable steps, each one either confirming or correcting the step before it. A gene identified, a trait confirmed in a mouse, an edit refined, a timeline adjusted when the biology doesn't cooperate. It's a strange kind of patience to watch, playing out inside a lab that also contains an animatronic dire wolf and a block of fake ice with a mammoth frozen inside it for visitors to photograph. The showmanship and the caution exist in the same building, and somehow, so far, neither one has canceled out the other. I keep thinking about the actual moment this started. Not the funding rounds, not the mice, but two men in a room, one of them asking a question he already suspected he knew the answer to, and the other one answering it honestly instead of picking something safer. There's a version of this story people tell that ends in 2028 with a mammoth calf standing in the snow. That version might happen. It might not. The version that's already true, right now, is smaller and, I think, more interesting. A company chasing the hardest possible proof that extinction doesn't have to be the final word on a species, using tools that got built along the way, whether the mammoth arrives or not. I'd like to ask you something, if you're still with me. Think about something you were told, at some point in your life, was simply gone for good. A place, a species, a piece of land, something you assumed no one was even trying to bring back. Tell me in the comments what that was, and whether you ever found out if someone, somewhere, was quietly working on it. Projects like this one are happening in labs most people will never hear about, on timelines measured in years rather than headlines. And the ones that succeed rarely look, at the start, like they were ever going to.